The story of Syria today is not about peace. It is about momentum lost. A handshake without scaffolding. A headline without an ending. Donald Trump lifted sanctions. He embraced Ahmed al-Sharaa. He signaled a dramatic reset. For a moment, the world looked again. But while cameras moved on, the system underneath stayed broken. In Aleppo, allies turned their guns on each other. More than 150,000 people fled in days. US brokered talks stalled. Ceasefires thinned. Trust evaporated. This is the danger of diplomacy built for impact, not endurance. I want you to pause here, because what's unfolding in Syria may become the first clear foreign policy failure of Trump's second act. And if it collapses, Syrians will pay the price. Not politicians, not mediators. If you care about how power really works in the world, stay with me. Because to understand this moment, we need to step back and ask a harder question. How did we get here? This crisis is not accidental. It is structural. The United States is now backing two opposing forces inside Syria: the Syrian government in Damascus and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. Both are American partners. Both believe Washington is on their side. That contradiction has been managed, not resolved. At the same time, the US is trying to broker security arrangements between Syria and Israel, while Israeli forces remain inside territory seized after December 2024, while airstrikes continue. Two negotiations, two fault lines, one thin diplomatic team. The problem is not intent, it is design. Trump's diplomacy creates openings, but it does not build systems. There are no timelines, no enforcement mechanisms, no institutions tasked with carrying agreements forward when attention fades. So progress freezes, then reverses. To see why this keeps happening, we need to look beneath the surface at how this approach to power actually works. To understand this moment, you have to go back, not years, but cycles. The collapse of the Assad regime in December 2024 did not end the Syrian war. It changed its geometry. Power fragmented instead of consolidating. The SDF emerged as a de facto authority in the northeast, armed, organized, politically ambitious. Damascus, weakened but sovereign, wanted reunification, fast, centralized. These goals were never compatible. The US stepped in as mediator, not as architect. Agreements were framed broadly, principles instead of procedures. This follows a familiar pattern in post-conflict economics. Stability requires institutions before growth, rules before trust. Syria got none of that. Without a framework, every negotiation became fragile, dependent on personalities, on presence, on pressure. And when those fade, systems snap back to their default setting: conflict. That fragility set the stage for what came next. The first rupture came quietly, then all at once. On 6 January, Syrian government forces moved into Kurdish-majority neighborhoods in Aleppo. They declared them closed military zones. The message was unmistakable. Negotiations had failed. Within days, more than 150,000 civilians were displaced. Families fled north, toward Afrin, toward SDF-held territory. A short ceasefire followed on 8 January. Evacuations, withdrawals, but no resolution. Sporadic clashes continued. Trust collapsed. This was not a misunderstanding. It was the consequence of months of deadlock. Damascus wanted absorption, individual fighters, full central command. The SDF demanded integration as a force, with identity, with autonomy. Oil fields, border crossings, local governance, all unresolved. And without a structured process, pressure replaced dialogue. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. You've seen it before. If you want to understand how fragile peace really is without institutions, keep watching. Because what happened in Aleppo was not the end, it was a warning. And it leads us to the deeper machinery driving this crisis. What failed in Syria was not negotiation, it was implementation. The March 2025 agreement between Damascus and the SDF looked promising on paper. Integration, representation, participation for all Syrians. But paper is not power. There were no binding timelines, no budget, no monitoring body, no dispute resolution mechanism. So every clause became a battlefield. Damascus interpreted integration as absorption, one army, one chain of command. The SDF interpreted it as coexistence, cohesive units, retained identity, local authority. Both sides claimed compliance. Both accused the other of violations. And because there was no referee, escalation became rational. US mediation depended on physical presence. When envoys arrived, talks moved. When they left, progress evaporated. This is the hidden mechanism of failure. Diplomacy without institutions creates dependency, not stability. It rewards brinkmanship, it punishes compromise, and it guarantees relapse. This same machinery is now grinding through a second, even more dangerous front, one that extends beyond Syria's borders. The second crisis unfolded in parallel, and it is even harder to contain. Trump wants Syria inside the Abraham Accords, a historic realignment, a symbolic victory. But symbols cannot outrun geography. Since December 2024, Israel has pushed forces into the UN-monitored buffer zone south of the Golan Heights. Positions on the Syrian side of Mount Hermon, expanded air operations across the country. These moves changed the bargaining table before talks even began. Still, negotiations happened. 5 rounds. The most recent, in Paris on 5 to 6 January, produced something that looked like progress. A joint communication cell, US oversight, intelligence sharing. But again, the core disputes were untouched. Syria demanded a binding withdrawal timeline. Israel demanded security guarantees, demilitarization, minority protections, 2 red lines, no bridge. Economic cooperation was floated as a stabilizer, useful but insufficient, because without dates, responsibilities, and verification, de-escalation becomes temporary theater. This is the second peak of the crisis, and it reveals the same flaw: headline breakthroughs, structural voids. And now, the consequences begin to move outward. Now let me bring this closer to you, because when systems fail, it is never abstract. If you are a Syrian parent, instability is not a theory. It is the sound of artillery at night. It is deciding what to carry when you flee. More than 150,000 people moved in days, not because they wanted to, but because negotiations collapsed in rooms they will never enter. When diplomacy stalls, prices rise, borders harden, jobs disappear, and fear becomes permanent. You are told peace is coming, again. You are asked to wait, again. This is what short-term diplomacy does to ordinary lives. It consumes time people do not have. If this matters to you, don't look away. Understanding power is the first step to holding it accountable, because what happens in Syria never stays in Syria. And that brings us to the global consequences. Syria does not exist in isolation. It never has. Instability travels along borders, along markets, along fear. When Syria fractures, Europe feels it first. Irregular migration rises, security services strain, counterterrorism risks multiply. For Israel, unresolved borders mean permanent mobilization. For Turkey, Kurdish instability bleeds across lines on a map that were never real. For the Gulf states, reconstruction without governance becomes a sunk cost. And for the United States, credibility erodes quietly, not in speeches, in calculations made by allies and rivals alike. This is how regional crises become systemic ones, not through explosions, through accumulation. Every unresolved dispute invites a workaround. Every workaround weakens rules. The irony is sharp. At the very moment the rules-based order is under strain, Syria becomes another exception. And history tells us where that leads. To understand where this path might end, we have to look forward, not with certainty, but with scenarios. The future of Syria now splits into three paths, not predictions, possibilities. The first is fragile progress. The EU steps in, not with speeches, with structure, clear timelines, conditional sanctions relief, monitoring, civilian-led governance support. It is slow, unpopular, but it works. The second path is managed stagnation. Ceasefires hold, then slip. Talks continue, then pause. No war, no peace. A country suspended in permanent recovery. The third path is collapse. Talks fail. Aleppo repeats, then spreads. Israel hardens its posture. The SDF digs in. Damascus centralizes by force. This is the Libya model, the Iraq model. Quick fixes, long shadows. Which path emerges depends on one choice, whether diplomacy becomes a process or remains a performance. And that choice brings us to the final insight. Syria is not failing because peace is impossible. It is failing because implementation is treated as optional. Donald Trump's diplomacy creates openings, but without institutions, openings close themselves. This is where Europe matters, not as a counterweight, but as a complement. The EU understands something history keeps teaching us. Peace is not an event, it is administration. Sanctions relief must stay conditional. Governance must be inclusive, and standards must apply to everyone, including Israel. When rules bend selectively, they break universally. This is not just Syria's test. It is a test of whether the international system still believes in itself. If you want to understand how power is actually exercised and how easily it fails, stay with this channel, because Syria will not be the last case. It will be the template.